Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jacob Hazard. I'm the Dean of Faculty. Unfortunately, Ms. Doherty, our head, will not be able to be here tonight. She's got some other things that she's having to attend to. Welcome to the Elizabeth Bennett reading. This gathering is always very special. It brings our community together to share a sampling of the awe-inspiring talent within our faculty. Coming early in the school year, it reminds me of how much discovery and creativity will unfold across our community in the months ahead. The Bennett Writing Grant, as you may know, is awarded annually to one faculty member for a 2-year writing project. Recipients demonstrate a reverence for the written word and a desire to share that passion with students and colleagues. Each is selected through a competitive process that requires careful plans, writing samples, and a vision for how their work will unfold. Elizabeth Bennett, for whom the grant is named, was a revered English teacher at Kingswood. Her former students recall her love of poetry, her rigorous standards, and her ability to awaken in them a lifelong appreciation for precision, discipline, and the beauty of language. As one alumna put it, quote, "Miss Bennett corrected meticulously, but knew just the right, deft way to recognize good work." Each fall, we gather to honor that legacy, to thank her former students at the Friends of the Fund who make these opportunities possible, and to celebrate our colleagues who carry forward her devotion to writing and teaching. If you are a past Bennett recipient, would you please stand so that we may recognize you? So tonight, we are in excellent company. Our readers are in excellent company. They represent both continuity and new directions of the life of the grant. I'm delighted to be able to share some exciting news about one of our Bennett alumni. Dr. Jeffrey Welch, a former member of our faculty, has just had his manuscript, which began in the 2004 Bennett Grant, accepted for publication by Michigan State University Press. His book explores the creative collaborations of campus architect Eliel Saarinen, sculptor Carl Millis, and founder George Booth. Dr. Welch's accomplishment is a powerful reminder that the rewards of the Bennett Grant continue to unfold years later. A summer project begun with this support can lead not only to personal growth and classroom enrichment, but also to scholarship that shapes fields far beyond Cranbrook. Tonight's readers join a distinguished line of colleagues whose work demonstrates how Ms. Bennett's legacy and the generosity of her former students and friends continues to nurture creativity across generations. Which brings us to the heart of this evening, the chance to hear directly from our Bennett writers. It is a pleasure to introduce our first reader, Dr. Gania Barlow, who is completing the 2nd year of her Bennett Award grant. A member of the English department, Gania is known for her originality with language and for inspiring students through the Crane Clarion in her classes. Last year, Gania debuted a story written during a one-story magazine workshop, a retelling of Odysseus' voyage through the eyes of his sister Ctemene. Her imaginative voice, grounded in scholarship, captured us all. This summer, she continued her Bennett project by completing The Song of the Mute Swan, the 3rd in her series inspired by the 12th century author Marie de France. This story, based on the Loon, is about a young couple separated by their parents who find a way to communicate via swan. For the first time, Gania has set one of these retellings in a modern context, the 1990s, which she jokes may still feel ancient to her students. She also used the summer to submit stories to contests and literary journals. Please join me in welcoming grant recipient, Dr. Gania Barlow.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks so much to the students and friends of Elizabeth Bennett who made this possible. So I did want to give just a little bit of historical context and background before I read most of the story, a little bit edited version of the story for length, but just because, as David said, this is a retelling of a medieval story, and I imagine that Marie de France and her characters are less familiar to most people than Homer and Odysseus and those kind of people. So I wanted to give a little bit of kind of setup for it. So Marie de France is the earliest known female author who wrote in French. And I don't say French author because, although she tells us she's de France, she wrote her works in England, which is why I studied her in my PhD on medieval English literature. And I could say a lot more here about the Anglo-Norman dialect of French and the Norman conquest and the history of the English language, but I won't. I'm going to leave that for another day. So, this is another picture. We've seen now two different pictures of Marie, but they're both just guesses. We don't actually really know anything about who she was, apart from the fact that she lived in England in the 12th century and was most likely connected to some sort of noble or royal court. And then she gives her name in one of her stories and says she's from France, right? But at that point she's living in England and writing in England. So de France is not her last name, this is to say, right? It's a description of her. And so that's why you might hear me call her Marie. It's not that we're besties and I just, talk about her by her first name. But that's the convention when scholars talk about her because that's really the only name that we know of her. So her most famous work is the lays, as we might say in English, which are short verse or poetic romances. Poems that are basically like short stories in some way, and that deal with the typical subject matter of medieval romance. So knights and ladies and adventure and magic, King Arthur kind of stuff. And in fact, one of her lays is about a knight with King Arthur's court, and another one is a werewolf story, which is very cool. But the one that I have retold today is neither of those, right? It's the story called Milan. And here's just a quick summary of Marie's story. So a young knight named Milan and a young noble lady who is nameless in Marie's story, as often her female characters are, interestingly, fall in love and accidentally get pregnant. So she hides this from her parents, and she has the baby raised by a family member. Milan leaves to go off and win fame as a knight doing jousts and tournaments, as you do, and the lady's parents marry her off to a rich lord. Milan and the lady still love each other, and they figure out how to secretly communicate by sending messages by a swan, which is sort of like a very fancy and romantic carrier pigeon. And this goes on for many years before the finally now grown-up son reunites his parents in the end. And what really struck me about this story was the separation of the couple and how difficult it is for them to communicate, but how they have to seek out this nearly magical means of communication to be able to reach each other and stay in touch. And they persist in keeping in touch with each other across all sorts of obstacles and across decades of time. So in my version, I decided that I wanted to modernize the story, and it occurred to me that that difficulty of communication was something that was sort of old-fashioned, right? In our modern age of being always online and connected, two young people in love would find it much harder to not be able to connect. So this made me think back to my own high school years in the 1990s, and no one do any math right now. And I decided to bring that personal experience by making the characters suburban 1990s teenagers. And I thought that having them be teenagers would give that sort of personal experience, that was my own perspective on the 90s, but then also be somewhat in keeping with the original story, and would help explain in this modern setting how they could be so out of control of their own lives and their own way of communicating with each other. So, I think that's enough setup. And again, as I said, I've trimmed the story a little bit, but I can give you the gist, basically, the most of it. So, the Song of the Newt Swan. You have to understand that communication worked differently in those days. You had to know something about a person to contact them. Their first and last names, possibly their parents' names, the country, state, and city they lived in, the location of their house on one specific street, the numerical digits of the house's particular telephone. And each house had just one telephone attached to it, so that you called the house, really, more than you called a person. And that information could change or be lost, and it could be difficult or even impossible to find it again. was stored in codices, physical books made of white paper, filled with lists upon lists of names and numbers. But each city had its own book, and though the world was smaller then, there were still a lot of cities in the country, not to mention the rest of the world. And even if you knew what city the person was in, or rather, what city their house was in, the book could be old, or the information could not have been put into it. And if you didn't know what city their telephone was in, you wouldn't ever be able to find it without searching through the telephone books of every single city in every single country in the entire world. Historic feats have been performed for love, but that was beyond what could be humanly expected. And so once upon a time, when a 16-year-old girl left for a 4-month-long internship with her childless cousin, she knew the location of her boyfriend's house and what its telephone number was. But when she returned from the home of her new mother cousin, returned unburdened, yet saggy, leaky, pulling herself together as best she could, she found she didn't know anymore. The information had changed. The connection had been lost. Let's call the girl Jennifer. It's not exactly that her name was Jennifer, but that it easily could have been. There were more than 1 million Jennifers born in that same cultural moment, the suburban late 1900s. The name comes from the Welsh, meaning fair one or white shadow, indicating beauty as well as ephemerality, insubstantiality. And so it encapsulates something about her astounding averageness, her exceptional conventionality, her indifference to thinking of herself in an individualized, crystallized kind of way. We'll call the boy Miles, which sounds more specific, but that's just an illusion. Miles comes from the Latin for soldier, one faceless body among the horde. In any case, once upon a time in the late 1900s, a Jennifer and a Miles fell in love and made an unremarkably perfect couple. But the need to conceal an accidental pregnancy gave their parents an opportunity to separate them, and they had no way to reach each other again by normal means. So they found an alternative form of communication, one that, though admittedly somewhat unconventional, was essentially just as efficient, reasonable, and technologically advanced as any other mode of communication available to them in that backward time. They sent messages via swan. Let's back up so you can get a little feel for their relationship. Jennifer was there first, had always been there since the day she was born, on the right street, in the right neighborhood, with the right friends. They had all been together since kindergarten, growing if possible more alike with each passing year. Blondish hair pulled straight with hot iron, brownish skin sparkling slightly with unnecessary concealer, bodies cinched, pierced, daubed here and there with dewy pinks. Miles came from out of nowhere, from several subdivisions away, at the end of the summer before sophomore year. Still, he was the same as them, not too smart or too dumb, not too tall or too short, youthfully attractive, passively athletic, correctly attired, strictly top 40. He was in no obvious way unique or special. He slipped into the still pond of their lives like a well-smoothed stone. Mrs. DeAngelis paired them up for the species project in bio. It could have been anyone else, any other 2 students, any number of other Jennifers. But she picked them and assigned them at random beneath swan. Classification: Eukaryota, Animalia, Chordata, Aves, and Seriformes, Anatidae, Cygnus, C. Olor. They met after school at the local branch library. They had both moved unconsciously to the children's section, sitting in 2 small chairs that were comforting without being comfortable, because they made them feel bigger than they were. Books with glossy pictures and oversized text spread out in front of them on the low round table. It was awkward and exciting in a completely typical way, full of anticipation, but no likelihood of surprises. Everyone expected them to get together. The project made them a pair, and a pair was basically a couple, so really there was no reason not to. But something totally unexpected happened in the midst of it all. As they sat slightly closer together than necessary, both intensely aware of where the other's knees were in relation to their own under the table, copying down facts about swans onto college-ruled, spiral-bound sheets. The male is called a cob, and the female is called a pen. Perhaps it was like some sort of singularity, both of them so blank, so average, so generic, that they collapsed in on themselves when put in such proximity, into some black hole of individuality, so that they started over, wormholing their way into a new universe. It started when someone drove by blaring Ace of Base, which was at #1 again on the charts, and they both began singing quietly along to the backing vocals at the same moment, unthinkingly. Their eyes met. She smiled a little, and he just blinked. She had started to flick her eyes back down to the encyclopedia, a paper codex that used to store information for school projects before the internet. When he said in a whisper that was quiet even for the library, "I don't like that song," she pretended not to hear him because it seemed like he hadn't quite meant to be heard, and also because she had realized, with a dizzy, tingling feeling in her stomach, that she didn't like it either, that she didn't like any of the popular songs, but it hadn't occurred to her before that that was a possibility. It hadn't occurred to him either until the words came out of his mouth as he was looking into her eyes. And now he was afraid, his own guts twisting, because it seemed like a sort of blasphemous confession, out of place in this brightly lit public setting, one that exposed something personal and risked setting him apart as different. As he waited for her to say something, he looked back up at her, and he saw her. Suddenly, there, hunched awkwardly in the recycled air, in a seat too small for him, he could see through the sheen of her concealer to the real skin and bones of her face. Though her chin was just a little too pointy, and one eye slightly wider open than the other, just beginning to awaken to the world. He could hear the quiet pop of her fingertips unsticking from the pages as she turned them carefully, like a child who has just learned to turn the pages of a book. She picked up her pen and tapped it on the open page, leaving a dot of turquoise ink in the middle of the subtitle, "Mating Habits," and said, "Mute swans begin building their nests in March or April." He remained frozen for a beat until she looked up at him again. And she saw him. Suddenly, there, in the overly bright lights and primary colors of youth nonfiction, as he sat seeing her, the blurry aura of bravado around him cleared, and she saw him. How he was a little stocky, compact, barely taller than her, wiry muscles still competing with the last remainders of baby fat. How his legs trembled with the effort of sitting still, so that he looked ready to bolt at the slightest provocation, to burst at the seams. Though she found it a little hard to breathe, she laughed nervously. And then, with a show of strength that made the blood pound in her ears, she rolled her eyes, poked him squarely in the chest, just over his heart, the clicker end of her pen, and said, "Write that down, dummy." The mute swan has white plumage and an orange bill with a distinctive black bump or knob. As they glide through the water, they bend their graceful necks in that classic S curve. They are the quintessential swan, the fairy tale swan, the swan you think of when you think of a swan. Beautifully unremarkable, generic. The male and the female of the species even look alike. But still somehow, two particular individual birds will find each other amongst all the indistinguishable, fluttering, swooning whiteness. And they will specifically choose each other, those two birds that are just the same as any other two birds. And they will, at least sometimes, mate for life. It was like they'd fallen off a cliff of some kind. If they weren't the same as everyone else, they could be anything. And they realized there were others like that too. People with green hair, clunky shoes, off-brand backpacks, and names like Marguerite. Had they always been there? They became secret agents. They stayed with their friends and acted just the same as always, and dressed the same, and laughed at the same jokes, and sang along with all the songs that they had never before considered the possibility of not liking. But when they were alone, they could turn it off. They could set it all down. What they found in each other was a kind of core, pocket, some hidden space outside of reality where they could set aside pretense. Some little darkened chamber of confession where they could let their inner voice show. And that emptiness had a fullness to it, a magnetism. They were drawn to it, oriented toward it, compass-like. The relief, the joy they found, that they felt for each other, was in not pretending that the pretense was real. To take off from the water, a swan has to use both wings and feet. Its body held by the water, surface tension clinging heavy to each primary covert and downy feather. And so the swan must push with everything it has, breaking that glossy mirror into shattered drops, turning massive wings, black feet pressing the surface of the water away, disdaining the wet world, and exploding into the sky. Whether or not they ever finished the Swan Project or what grade they got, those details are lost to time and anyway are irrelevant. The important academic turning point for them was not the project. It was when they discovered they had failed the most foundational lesson of that year's required one-credit health class. They got pregnant. A baby swan is called a cygnet. Jennifer was granted leave from the last couple months of the school year. The cover cover story was that she had an unmissable opportunity for an internship with her young entrepreneur cousin Isla in LA, who was coincidentally in the market for a baby. And there's a little more backstory on cousin Isla in the full story. Isla planned to give the boy a name that was aggressively, self-consciously unique, sans peur, from the old French meaning peerless, but also punnily fatherless. And then there's a little bit more about Jennifer's time there. But then, without any warning, one baking hot summer day, Miles' family canceled his registration for junior year, disconnected their house's telephone, and moved away. He tried to stay in touch. He wrote down his new information in green ink on yellow paper, inscribing his connection to her diagonally across the even-ruled lines with a sloppy, earnest hand. But somehow the paper hadn't gotten to her, and there was no other record of it. No cloud, no profile, no cookies, no bites. The information about where he had gone was singular, evanescent. To their bevy of friends, he had just said he would call when he got there, and part of him had meant it. But it didn't take long for him to realize that the new friends in the new place were just the same. And he knew that the space he had left behind in their lives would soon fill up with a footprint in wet sand, reabsorbed into the flock's elastic surface. Only Jennifer missed him, and he only missed her. And why he didn't keep trying to call her at least, or send a second letter, is another question that's lost to time. Perhaps he lost his address book in the move, or maybe he had never written the information down. People often used to keep things like that logged in their minds in those days, a primitive but surprisingly effective form of data storage. And maybe he just forgot the specific numbers in the specific order that could magically open up the lens of communication at her parents' house. He'd never been great with numbers. By the time she came back in August, post-baby, she hadn't heard from him in 2 months. So obviously she knew something was wrong, but she didn't know exactly what. But Becky would know, but she didn't telephone any of their houses or knock on their doors. Her absence had created an ambiguity, a loophole, which gave her a chance to avoid them for a while. She spent August alone, skipping a scene of her return to school. Every day at school, she was the same as them. She was correct. She even started dating one of the Michaels, or maybe a Matthew. It doesn't really matter. School wasn't her real life, or it may have been life, but it wasn't real. Every day after school, she retreated to her spot in the backyard, half reclined on the faded deck lounger, gazing blankly down the perfect uniform lawn, just a shade too green. This was the view that stretched out before her every day to the end of time. She could feel her legs pressing cell by cell into the vinyl straps of the chair, taking its shape, fitting her body back into this landscape. Her breath in and out in small cycles of life and death, repetition without change. And just when she began to think she couldn't take it anymore, just exactly at the moment that the stifling hot breeze over the lawn shifted to a cool whisper of autumn, which is what happened today. A strange, almost mechanical sound broke the silence of the afternoon around her, a whirring, whistling, pulsing sound, swelling louder in even beats, and approach. She looked up at the sky, expecting the familiar endless vacancy, and saw instead the swan. As Cygnus oler flies, their long, slender necks stretches so straight that it seems to be pulling them forward by sheer willpower, effortlessly, so that you almost don't notice the enormous body defying gravity with its plump bulk, the powerful wings that hum as they beat their way through the air, taking up a sonic space equivalent to the enormous size of the not-so-mute swan. It circled the yard, drifting lower, then reached its feet toward the little pond, black webs touching at one end, slapping the surface several times to test it out, then seeming to skate weightlessly for a moment, carving a long wake across the water to mark its arrival, before settling its body down with just the slightest plop splash, a fluffing of wings and a satisfied little shake of its tail. She didn't move, hands gripping the edges of her deck chair to steady herself. The swan glided, turned, beheld her with one dark eye. It stretched its beak up and back down and wriggled its body in a motion that struck her strangely like an eye roll. And then it let out a kind of a purr snort, a stifled, grunty sound that couldn't be more ill-suited to the smooth perfection of its exterior. It repeated the sound, which made her laugh in a disbelieving short gasp, then fixed her in its sight again, its demanding left eye, with the clear message that this reading was meant for her, that the swan was there for her. They met at the wet pebble edge of the pond. The swan's seemingly random waddles slowly moved it closer and closer to her until it was in arm's reach. out its long neck and gave her a little nip on her right arm, the hard black nail of its beak, then followed this up with a softer kind of nudge. She gave the swan a gentle pat on its head, but this led to another nip. She tried petting its wing again, nip. Her arms would be black and blue, but she knew the swan didn't mean to discourage her. Could easily have gotten up and walked away, but it just sat there primly, darting its neck out now and then in another restrained but still painful nip. In its violent dinosaur way, it seemed to even be encouraging her, guiding her. The exploration and the pain were both part of the process of the swan claiming and identifying her, and vice versa. She had to choose again and again to believe in it, to believe that they were there together, girl and swan, by reaching out to touch the other wing, nip, tail feathers, nip, neck, nip, nip, until finally she believed. And with a swelling fullness in her chest, she reached both arms around its back and leaned into it in an embrace. The swan grumbled, purred, and rubbed its neck against her head. This was her first hug since Miles. And as she began to sit back up, pushed upright by this realization, her hand brushed against something incongruous, rustling, inorganic, tucked into the feathers along the swan's upper back near its shoulders. A Ziploc bag with a note inside. Sloppy, earnest handwriting and green on lined paper. It doesn't matter what the note said. Its words were most likely embarrassing, even stupid. Certainly both over and underwritten, sentimental, inexact, and all. What matters is that they were his words for her. He said, not in so many words, but more directly than he'd ever said before, that he loved her. And she felt herself firm up inside, solidify, settle. She pulled herself together, and she saw herself reflected in the black pool of the swan's eye. It's not that being loved by a boy defined her, or not exactly that, or not only that. And anyway, it was the same for him with her. It was like they'd been living in a funhouse mirror maze, and couldn't tell, amid all the infinite flashing faces and gyrating movements and kaleidoscope colors, which, if any, was the original, was real. But when they were together, everything slowed down and stopped spinning. And when they communicated with each other, when they saw each other, they began to see themselves too. Like the optical illusion of the vase or the two faces, where the space between the two people defines them, shapes them. But for Jennifer and Miles, the space between them was in the shape of a swan. I understand why you would ask the very reasonable question where the swan came from in the first place. But you have to understand, things like that just happened back then. It was a more innocent, enchanted time. The world wasn't bound by webs. Every country in Europe had its own currency. Children could play outside unattended. People believed that dinosaurs could be reborn from amber, but they couldn't see what distant galaxies looked like. Robots didn't know how to write poetry. A wall falling down could surprise the whole world. Swans could deliver messages between lovers. She sent a letter to him, and he sent one back to her. And this went on for years, for decades. But time didn't seem to pass, even as life went on around them. They were held still together, the three of them, in the only time and space that mattered. In the space of the swan, they were able to become their best selves, their true selves, the inner selves they saw in their mind's eye. They were able to speak with the voices they heard in their heads, rather than the voices other people heard come out of their mouths. They were never unsure around each other, never afraid. Outside of the swan, the world spun on. But they couldn't be expected to keep track of the people they were there, those exterior selves. What they studied in college, what jobs they got, what cities and houses they moved to, who they married and divorced. It's all lost to time, and anyway, it's not relevant. None of that was real. Only the swan was real. Only the letters, only the selves they built as they pressed them character by character, line by line, onto those pages and sent them along to each other. This was all they needed and all there was, until the day that Jennifer opened the door. Until I opened the door, and there you are. Fully grown little Signet, beautiful, fantastical boy, sparkling with color and light, dewy pink ombre around your father's amber brown eyes, enveloped in a white feather boa for dramatic effect. When the world zooms in and the ears crash down as you open your mouth and you say, "Hi, Mom." As I had hoped, you are peerless, Aurora Avis, the fingerprint of a snowflake. But that's true of all the children of the 21st century, and so, of course, you are all the same. You're dressed for a live stream of our reunion, in the event you forget to hit record, you're still clutching your phone in one hand. In these modern times, everyone has their own personal telephone, but no one ever calls each other. While your other hand reaches out, as though to take mine, but then twists into a hesitant wave and stutters back to your side, your shell of irony cracked through by earnestness. But you persevere in your project to reunite your birth parents and give their lives the glow-up they so desperately need. You take us each by the hand and you set up our profiles. Instagram, the app formerly known as Twitter, even Facebook, which you laughingly dubbed age-appropriate. You link us up again, our own little parent trap. One click of a button and the world suddenly snaps to grid, flattened out and synchronized. I can almost feel the dust settling into my bones from the shattering of that enchanted isolation. The faintest slickness on my skin from the popped bubble. And suddenly we are together again, Miles and I. First on the screen, and then in person, face to age progressed face. At 40-something, we are hardened around some edges and softened around others, but in all the wrong places. Both of us gray and deflated, the glamour gone off. No longer the princess in the tower and the intrepid, enamored knight. Just two typical middle-aged adults. We never see our swan again after that. I suppose it would be quite old too by this time. Now, instead of the swan, we are together again in the world. Now we have to live with each other's exterior selves, our bodies, jobs, lives, the voices we can hear come out of each other's mouths. We are unsure around each other. We are afraid. Thank you.
That was beautiful. I feel like I was a teenager. I also feel like the new swan is pretty close to my plans for talking to girls. It's always far as I tell. Thank you, Gania. It's wonderful to see how imaginative your work continues to grow, and we know how much your students benefit from seeing their teacher deeply engaged in the writing life. As Dean of Faculty, part of my role is to ensure that our teachers know about and apply for the Bennett Writing Grant. I will share application details with faculty later this year, and I hope many of you will consider submitting. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's second reader, Mr. Gianfranco Cataldo. Gianfranco is a teacher of world languages, and this year's Bennett Grant has supported both his PhD work and his classroom practice. His project focuses on how contemporary Venezuelan novels portray dictatorship in the years after Hugo Chavez. Beginning with Alberto Herrera Chisca, Patria o Muerte, Gianfranco has explored the ways in which literature elevates and questions the reverence of authoritarian leaders, while also linking back to Latin America's long tradition of dictatorship novels. Committee members who reviewed his application noted his passion for scholarship, his commitment to sharing that process with his students, and his detailed vision for how the grant would enrich both his academic journey and his teaching here. As a member of the reading committee commented, his students will benefit from sharing in this project that combines an exploration of rich Latin American cultural tradition, as well as the encouragement of critical thinking and a multidisciplinary approach. Please join me in welcoming Bennett Grant recipient, Mr. Gianfranco Cataldo.
Good evening. Just allow me a couple of seconds to. So, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank all of you for being present tonight here. And my gratitude goes to the supporters of the Bennett Grant, the organizers of the Bennett Reading, the school administrators, and the members of the Bennett Award Committee for this opportunity and recognition. A heartfelt thank you goes to my wonderful colleagues on my department, my friends, and my students for joining me this evening. I also want to express my gratitude to my advisor, Dr. Victor Figueroa, for his incredible support, patience, and inspiring insights, and to all the members of my doctoral committee. Additionally, please let me thank you, my family, my wife Francesca, and my sons, Giuseppe and Gianfranco, for showing me every single day the love and the care that give meaning to my life. I have often told my colleagues that there is one English adjective that perfectly describes the experience at Cranbrook I had as a teacher, as an educator, and parent of two younger students. The adjective I always use is blessed. But tonight, more than ever, I feel truly blessed to be here and to share my work with you. As you can see from the first slide here, my PhD thesis focused on the representation of dictatorship in post-Chavista Venezuelan fiction. But why Venezuelan literature? Well, before diving into the literary analysis, it's essential to understand why studying Venezuelan literature matters today. Beyond my personal and family connection, I am interested in what happens in Venezuela because the nation is currently enduring one of the most severe political and humanitarian crises in Latin American history. Just last year, contested presidential election marked by lack of transparency and violent repression took place in Venezuela. President Nicolás Maduro was reconfirmed amid widespread international rejection, and this regime continues to consolidate power while the opposition persists in challenging his legitimacy. The opposition candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia, was ultimately forced into exile in Spain. And the most prominent opposition figure, Maria Corina Machado, remains in hiding within Venezuela for her own safety. Under Maduro's government, Venezuela has experienced its darkest hour, defined by systematic corruption, devastating hyperinflation, repression of dissidents, and mass exodus of its people. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, nearly a quarter of the population, creating one of the largest refugees crises in the world. Meanwhile, diplomatic relations between the US and Venezuela continue to deteriorate, and Maduro faces narco-terrorism charge from the current US administration. In such a context, Venezuelan literature becomes more than art. It becomes testimony. It serves as a resource to resistance, collective memory, and a reminder of how easily democratic governance can slide into authoritarianism. Let's start with the story, okay? To understand deeper the current situation, and it's good that we need to revisit the recent political history. Before Maduro, former soldier Hugo Chavez Frias rose to power in 1999 after a failed coup in 1992 and a brief imprisonment. After his election, he promised a Bolivarian revolution that would transform Venezuela and redistribute wealth to the poor. Venezuela holds its world's largest proven oil reserve, and the Chavez regime was sustained by oil revenue during the period of high prices, enabling widespread nationalization, massive social programs, and strong alliances with leftist government in Latin America. He cultivated close ties with Russia, Cuba, Iran, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and adopted populist policies and indeed polarized Venezuelan society into Chavista and his opposition. Chavez was a charismatic orator who dominated Venezuelan politics and media for 14 years, positioning himself as a central figure in the anti-imperialist struggle. His image became deeply intertwined with that of Simón Bolívar, the nation-founding hero. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, he left behind a polarized nation and to his chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, Madurismo. So let's talk about Madurismo. Maduro won the presidency by narrow margin in 2013 and continued Chavez's revolutionary rhetoric. However, he lacked of Chavez's charisma and popular appeal. What followed his election was a catastrophe. External factors such as failing oil prices and international sanctions, combined with internal crises such as rapid violence and collapse of the national production, political persecution, turned Venezuela, once the Latin America, the most prosperous nation, into one of the poorest and most violent countries in America, with a widespread shortage of food, medicine, and basic services. Maduro's response to national and international attacks was an authoritarian switch. He created Constituent Assembly to bypass the opposition-led legislature, relied heavily on military and Cuban support, and intensified repression. As a result, living in Venezuela was harder and harder. Millions of Venezuelans have permanently left the country in search of safety and opportunity, and some of the immigrants are still facing backlashes and racial prejudice worldwide. This era of Madurismo forms part of the political backdrop of the novels I examined in my research. In my doctoral research, I examined the literary representation of the post-Chavista regime in contemporary Venezuelan novels, those written after Chavez's death. My goal is twofold: to analyze how contemporary Venezuelan writers represent authoritarianism from different perspectives, and to situate their work within a broader Latin American tradition of dictatorship literature, a tradition that spans more than a century. The four post-Chavista novels I studied each offer unique perspective on the transition from Chavismo to Madurismo, capturing Venezuelans' lived experience during the turbulent period. Ultimately, my research contributes to updating the Latin American dictatorship's novel tradition for the 21st century, revealing how writers adapt and innovate to confront new forms of authoritarianism. This is my research review, as you can see here. The corpus is constituted by 4 novels. The novels that I will analyze are Patria o Muerte by Alberto Barrera Tisca, Diorama by Ana Teresa Torres, Volver a Cuando by Maria Elena Moran, and Simpatia by Gianfranco Cataldo. Together, these novels span nearly a decade of literary production under Maduro's regime. The question that may arise is, why these novels? The answer is that these novels were all written after Chavez's death, so 2013, and they directly engaging in what post-Chavista transition was. Second, given to the Venezuelan economic crisis, censorship, and the writer exiles, contemporary literary output is limited, making these works especially valuable. Most renowned Venezuelan novels are published today abroad, and each of these 4 implies a distinct representational strategy. Patria o Muerte explores the sacralization and the desacralization of the dictator figure. Diorama offers a dystopian vision of Venezuelan future. Volver a Cuando examines the exile and the political disillusionment. Simpatia uses allegory through dogs and human to evoke solidarity and resistance. Together they form a multifaceted portrait of life under the Maduro's regime. Despite their differences, these novels share several traits. They highlight the resilience of ordinary people under the repression and oppression, and often end with open, unresolved conclusions, mirroring the ongoing uncertainty in Venezuela's political reality. They underscore survival and the haunting persistence of authoritarianism, offering no easy hope, only truth. Well, through multiple voices and perspectives, they portray post-Chavista Venezuela in all its complexity. Before diving into my summer research, it's important to note that Latin American literature has long engaged with dictatorship. Canonical words include Asturias, El Señor Presidente, García Márquez, The Autumn of the Patriarch, Roa Bastos, I, the Supreme, and Vargas Llosa's Conversation in the Cathedral, among others. Within the larger Latin American context, Venezuela has also its own tradition of dictatorship novels, and the most notably examples are Rómulo Gallegos' Gania Barlow and Arturo Suslas Petri's Oficio de Difuntos. What distinguishes Posteristas' novel from their predecessor is the immediacy. They respond to current events rather than distant history. Their focus shifts from psychological aspect of the dictator to the collective experience of the people, emphasizing social decay and shared suffering over the individual power. Now, I would like to delve into my research, summer research, centered on Patria Muerte. Literally, it means fatherland or death. And this is the novel by Alberto Barrera-Tisca, published on November 12, 2015, by Tusquets Editores in Barcelona. Two translations are available. The English one with the title The Last Day of El Comandante, 2020, published by University of Texas Press, and the French version, Le Dernier Jour du Commandant, of 2018, published by Gania. I will use both the original and the English version for the excerpt that I will read tonight. The novel, written 2 years after Chavez's death, portrays the national uncertainty between December 2012 and March 2013. And this is about the final public appearance in illness and death of Chavez. One of the main figures in the novels is Miguel Sanabria, a former oncologist facing retirement, who is involuntarily involved in a secret plan by his nephew Vladimir to hide a telephone allegedly containing the last video of Chavez in Cuba. The novel also explores the intricate lives of other characters, such as Freddy Lecuna, a frustrated writer who is pressured to write a novel and who ends up writing a pro-Chavez book. Andreina Mijares, an immigrated young Venezuelan who, upon her return to Caracas, struggles to recover the apartment she has rented to the Lacuna's family. Other important characters in the novel are Antonio, Miguel Sanabria's brother, and Maria, a young girl who loses her mom in an attempt of robbery in Caracas and finds a way to overcome her psychological and daily challenges thanks to the help of his boyfriend, Rodrigo, met on the web. Through multiple intertwined characters, the novel captured the sense of anxiety and uncertainty provoked by the lack of information about Chavez's health. Additionally, it shows the transition of Chavez as a myth to Chavez as a mortal man, and how this factor influences the life of Venezuelans. This is where the concept of political sacralization and desacralization becomes essential. Before I start diving in, I want to introduce the author of the novel. Alberto Barrera-Tisca was born in Caracas in 1960, and his family is from Spain, has a Spanish and Polish descent. He studied for a degree in literature at the Central University of Venezuela, where he also taught for 7 years. His literary debut was with the poetry collection Coyote des Ventanas and Tal vez el Frío. Alongside teaching and journalism, he began writing short stories collected such as Edición de Lujo, and made his debut as a novelist with También el Corazón. His most recent novel is entitled El fin de la tristeza, and in collaboration with the journalist Cristina Marcano, his wife, he published the first documented biography of the president Hugo Chavez, whose title is Hugo Chavez Sin Uniform. In addition, Barrera-Tisca has worked as a television script writer in Venezuela, Mexico, and Argentina. He's a regular columnist for outlets like El País, El Nacional, the New York Times, Letras Libres, and among other platforms too. During the presentation of his novel in Spain in 2015, he explained the motives that led him to undertake this writing. This translation is mine. There was a moment that seems to me very, very important, a small note in the newspaper. Back when Chavez was agonizing, I don't remember in which paper, there was a short piece saying that one of his bodyguards had declared had been with Chavez at some point in Havana, and that Chavez was suffering greatly and crying. And that struck me as something remarkable, because I thought, this is the real news, you know? This is stronger and more dangerous for the regime than the diagnosis of the illness itself. He has a kind of revelation thinking. He is the state that has sacralized a man, and then there is another man, a smaller one, very close to him, who says that this man is not God anymore. This man is a human, and that he cries. It seems to me that there was a kind of thread there, something around which stories could be rebuilt and organized. So if there was a spark, it was that note. The idea of saying, in Venezuela, there has been constructed, or rather, Chavez was a myth in the making. And there was this process we Venezuelans experienced during that period of agony. The process of transforming the state into a sort of religion. Then the fact that the humanity itself and something as human as illness could bring us back down to earth and become something subversive, or could turn into something subversive. This statement brings to my analysis, my actual analysis. I wanted to examine the phenomenon of sacralization of the political figure within the text. According to the Real Academia Española, the official Spanish institution regulating the Spanish language, the term sacralization stems from the verb sacralizar, which means to attribute or to confer a sacred character to something that did not have it. This definition perfectly fits, in my opinion, the transformation of Chavez into a messianic figure, a redeemer of the poor described in the novel. Let's see some examples, okay, the early example of sacralization, and the first instance that appears in the association between Chavez and Christ. The narrator expresses it this way. This is how it happened. Throughout 2012, Chavez gradually built himself as a religious figure, and at the end of the year, in the message read out to the army, he wrote, "The people of Simón Bolívar are the light of the world." His church started to professionalize in 2013. Very soon, people began talking about Chavez as a redeemer of the poor, martyr of the oppressed. Ceremonial rhetoric announcing the definitive creation of a new congregation began to seep into political discourse. In his name, through him, and he, him, the vice president once said, alluding to, of course, to El Comandante. The new slogans were already pointing towards the heavens. Let us be like Bolívar. Let us be like Chavez. The new president, his voice silenced, began to be replaced by the myth. In his land of symbols, the real Chavez was dying. The sick man was becoming less and less sick, and increasingly an image without a body, a sacred image. The cute, irascible, authoritarian, and whimsical Chavez was fading away, giving way to a new fictional character, a fetish. The cancer could only be cured with the sacrament. Mystic marketing launched its latest religious product. Here's the Christ of the poor. A second example of sacralization emerges when Chavez and his supporters symbolically identified him with Simón Bolívar, the great hero of the Venezuelan independence in the 19th century. The narrator expresses the analogy with these words, and these are just some of the excerpt of the book, of the novel. Miguel was irritated and depressed by growing religiousness that had been creeping over the government during the first few months of 2012. He found the idolization of the president harder and harder to bear. People spoke about Chavez as if he were the reincarnation of Simón Bolívar. Another stage, contemporary to the others, is the sacralization of the state. Religious language and ritual permit Chavismo. Supported built altars, held vigils, and prayed for Chavez's health as if faith could cure him. The state began to function like a church, complete with its own discourse, liturgy, and code of personality. The following excerpt illustrates this clearly. Chavez's absence was causing more and more unease, above all because there were no direct messages from the president. Everything people knew about him came from other people, a few officials, like a government's high command, or from people who weren't officials, such as journalists or mere spectators who claimed to have clandestine sources. Speculation had continued to reign, and the days went by. It seems to seize the country completely. The truth was increasingly fragile experience. There was no longer any pretense. Chavez's health was not a medical but a religious matter. The government high command began speaking like priests. The state began to look like a church. While these aspects reveal the sacralization of Chavez, the novel simultaneously performs the opposite process, desacralization. Here again, I refer to the definition of Real Academia Española. According to this online dictionary, desacralization stems from desacralizar, which means to remove the sacred character from someone or something. In the first pages of the novel, Chavez is described as in all his fragility, with such as a parody of the unstoppable orator in the Venezuela. The Venezuelans were accustomed to hear and to watch in his monologues for hours and hours in TV. This is the first description in this sense. Chavez looked thin and pale. He was in his feet behind a podium, and oddly, he was reading out a written text instead of improvising in front of cameras. It was unheard of for this man, so fond of speaking for hours in front of any audience, to restrict himself to a few words, suddenly held hostage by a small piece of paper. The concept of illness, the fear for a metastatic evolution of his first detected cancer at the beginning, appears to be relegated only to the figure of Chavez, and all his supporters were afflicted by the sad news. Voters of the opponent party and anti-Chavistas such as Beatriz, Sanabre's wife, are portrayed either as celebrating for the bad news about his health, or skeptical about the official news promoted by the government about Chavez's condition. Later, the metaphorical sense of a suffering body applies and extends to the whole nation. In the words of the main narrator, Chavez is such an egomaniac that he could bear to be alone in his sickness. He had to go and infect the rest of the country. In Patria Muerte, Chavez's illness reveals his fragility and humanity, and throughout the novel, this aspect helps humanize the incorruptible and sacred halo created by the president and his allies. As the Venezuelans saw him weakened and suffering, the myth began to erode. In the novel appears secret videos allegedly showed him crying, terrified by death, an image completely at odds with his divine and untouchable persona. As the narrator describes, he was crying, he was in a great deal of pain, and he didn't want to die. He was begging for help, for them not to let him die. He was weak, fragile, terrified. He was crying, complaining. He was very afraid of death, like anyone would be. The leader who once dominated every media channel becomes, in the end, a trembling mortal, a manuscript of divinity. This humanization dismantles the myth and turning the good back into a human and into a man. In conclusion, Padre Muerte presents a powerful interplay between sacralization and desacralization, transforming Chavez's body into a both mythic symbol and the site of decay. By portraying him simultaneously as the Christ figure and the dying man, the novel exposes the tension between faith and disillusionment that define post-Chavismo. The Madurismo, which is the political background of the other novel I selected for my PhD project, is projected and based upon the legacy of Chavismo, albeit there are some evident differences between the two presidents. This ambiguity of Chavez's role and influence on the population situates Venezuelan literature within the broader Latin American tradition of dictatorship novels, where personal and collective trauma interwoven. Barrera Tisca's work stands as both a reflection and warning, shedding light on the psychological scars and the ever-present risk of authoritarianism disguised as a redemption. Venezuelan authors remind us while Venezuela's experience is unique, it echoes patterns of authoritarianism across the continent. In this sense, literature becomes a means to understand the power, resistance, and endurance. Looking ahead, I plan to transform my research into pedagogy. Upon completing my dissertation, I wanted to develop a course whose tentative title is Literature and Power, Politics in Latin America Through Fiction. This course will take a multidisciplinary approach, combining close literary analysis with historical and political context, and will bridge my research with the classroom engagement. My goal is to help students understand how literature reflects and shapes the dynamics of power, identity, and resistance, not only in Latin America but globally. In our present moment of democratic fragility, these lessons are more relevant than ever, I think. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gianfranco, and thank you to both of our readers. You've given us compelling stories and ideas that remind us of the importance of writing as a way of making meaning in the world. Our students are fortunate to have you and to learn from you as teachers who pursue their own writing with seriousness. And we, your colleagues, are equally fortunate to be inspired by your example. As we close, I'd like to recall the words of Miss Bennett's students in the 1959 Kingswood Yearbook, which was dedicated to her. Quote, "You have illuminated for us the great realm of literature from Moses to Mogul. Even when engulfed by your book reports, critical papers, and clarion proofs, you always have an encouraging word or a bracing comment for us. To obey your dictum, be specific. It is to you, Miss Bennett, that with love and respect we dedicate our woodwinds." And so we dedicate this evening of readings to Ms. Bennett and to all teachers and mentors who inspire us with their willingness to share their passions and talents. Thank you all for being a part of this celebration of talented writers.